Okay, picture this. It's 1789. France is just exploding with these incredible revolutionary ideas. Liberty, equality, fraternity for all. I mean, it's a world-changing moment. But underneath all that amazing promise, there was this massive, glaring contradiction. One that involved hundreds of thousands of lives and, you guessed it, a ton of money.
So you really have to ask, how could a country that was completely redefining what it means to be free still justify keeping people in chains? Well, the answer isn't simple. It's this powerful clash between these amazing revolutionary ideals and, well, cold, hard economic reality. So let's dive in and unpack this whole thing.
All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to dig into that core contradiction. Then, we'll follow the money to see this economy literally built on chains. We'll see how those high-minded ideals crashed into powerful financial interests. Check out a huge victory for freedom that was tragically short-lived. And then finally, we'll get to the story of the final abolition. So let's start right at the beginning with the revolution's central problem. This amazing new idea of liberty smashing right up against the brutal everyday reality of slavery. I mean, listen to this sentence. It's the heart of the whole revolution. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It's powerful. It's universal. But while these words were being cheered in the streets of Paris, they were basically a cruel joke thousands of miles away in France's colonies. The entire system there was built on the absolute opposite of this idea. So, to understand why the revolution hesitated on ending slavery, you really only have to do one thing: follow the money. And that money was absolutely pouring out of colonies like Martinique and Saint-Domingue. We're talking about some of the most profitable pieces of real estate on the entire planet at the time. And it all came down to the plantation economy. The whole system was designed to grow these cash crops on a massive scale to sell back in Europe. But it had one absolutely brutal requirement: a huge, constant supply of forced labor. Europeans weren't exactly lining up for that backbreaking work in the tropical heat, so the solution was the transatlantic slave trade. And look at what was being grown. This wasn't just basic food. This was the luxury stuff that Europeans were getting completely hooked on. The growing demand for sugar in your tea or that coffee in your cup, it was directly fueling a growing and absolutely horrific demand for enslaved people to produce it. This system created what's known as the triangular trade, and it was horrifyingly efficient. Ships would sail from French ports like Bordeaux and Nantes down to Africa, where they would literally purchase human beings. These people were then branded, shackled, and packed into ships for a brutal 3-month journey across the Atlantic just to be sold. And this trade didn't just support the colonies, it made the port cities in France itself incredibly wealthy. So there it is, our central conflict. You have the soaring, beautiful ideals of the revolution on one side, crashing head-on into the profitable, brutal reality of the slave trade on the other. Now, early in the revolution, they actually talked about this. The new National Assembly directly asked the question, should the rights of man apply to everyone? But you had powerful businessmen whose entire fortunes depended on the slave trade who pushed back hard. They were terrified of the economic fallout, so the assembly did nothing. And this is really the core of it all, isn't it? On one side, you've got this incredible promise of universal rights for all people. On the other, you have the immense profits and the wealth of entire cities built on slavery. For years, the economic interests just flat out won. All that revolutionary talk of freedom in Paris was completely drowned out by the clinking of coins in the port cities. But here's the thing, the enslaved people weren't just waiting around for Paris to give them their freedom. As the revolution got more and more radical, the pressure was building. You had huge slave rebellions led by brilliant people like Toussaint Louverture and Saint-Domingue who were forcing the issue. And a new government in France was finally ready to listen. This new government was called the Convention. It was led by a pretty radical group known as the Jacobins, and they were pushing for all sorts of extreme social reforms. And they were finally ready to confront the issue of slavery head-on. And in 1794, they did something absolutely historic. The convention passed a law that freed all enslaved people in all French territories. For a moment, it really seemed like the revolution had finally lived up to its promise. This was one of the biggest wins for abolition in the entire 18th century. But, and it is a massive but, this victory was tragically short-lived. Less than 10 years later, in 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power, and he brings slavery back. The plantation owners had actually argued that their freedom included the right to enslave other people for their own profit, and Napoleon agreed. Just like that, the fight for freedom had to start all over again. And that brings us to the final and frankly long overdue chapter in this whole struggle. 1848. Just let that number sink in. It took nearly 60 years, that's 2 full generations after the Declaration of the Rights of Man said all men were free, for slavery to be finally and permanently abolished in all French territories. The decades-long battle between ideals and interests had at last come to an end. So what are the big takeaways here? Well, first, that ideals, no matter how powerful they are, really struggle when they go up against huge economic interests. And second, that progress is almost never a straight line. The path to freedom was this painful seesaw. It was won, then lost, and then finally won again after a fight that lasted for decades. And that leaves us with a final, kind of unavoidable question. This history really forces us to ask, how often today do we see powerful economic interests standing in the way of fundamental human rights? It's a conflict that definitely didn't end in 1848. It's really something to think about.